She was 29 years old, standing at the edge of a gravel road in Montana Territory, with $3 in her palm and nowhere in the world that would call itself her home. The man who put her there was her own father-in-law, a rancher named Silas Whitfield, who blamed her for his son's death in a rock slide and used his grief as a reason to do what he had wanted to do for years, which was to be rid of her before she could claim a single acre that might rightfully have been hers. He gave her $3 from the household tin, told the hired hands not to help her load her trunk, and watched from the porch as she walked the 4 miles into the town of Sable Creek, carrying everything she owned. With those same $3 standing in the cold outside the county bank 2 days later, she bought an ice house that the whole town had already forgotten, a sagging building of black timber and sawdust that nobody else would even bid on. It seemed like the last foolish act of a woman with nothing left to lose. But beneath the old ice packed inside that building, frozen for years under a blanket of sawdust and silence, lay something that would not only restore everything Delia Whitfield had lost, but would return to an entire town what one dishonest man had spent a decade quietly stealing from it. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Delia Whitfield. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten tonight, a town that time seems to have passed by, or a season of your life that feels as cold and empty as an old ice house in December, tell us in the comments, because this story was written for you. Delia had not always been a Whitfield, and she had not always been alone. She was born Cordelia Ann Pruitt Larson, though everyone who knew her simply called her Delia, in a river town in Wisconsin where her father, a Norwegian immigrant named Anders Larson, cut and stored ice for a living. Before she was old enough to properly hold a saw, she was already following him down to the frozen river in the gray dawn of January, watching the men score the ice into great blue-white blocks with long-handled saws, watching the horses drag the sledges up the bank, watching her father pack each block in sawdust inside the ice house with the patience of a man tending something sacred. He used to tell her that ice was the strangest kind of treasure there was, because it looked like it was worth nothing at all, cold and hard and common as water. And yet a single well-kept block could mean the difference between a family eating fresh meat in July or eating nothing, between a fevered child having something cool against her forehead or having nothing to ease her, between a town surviving a long, hot summer or suffering through it. He taught her to test the thickness of new ice with the flat of her hand before she ever trusted it with her weight, to pack sawdust deep enough that even August could not reach through it, and to never, ever assume that something quiet and frozen and out of sight was therefore worthless. Most of all, he taught her that patience was not the same thing as weakness, that a person who was willing to wait and to tend something faithfully while nobody was watching was often the very person who ended up saving everyone else when the heat of the year finally came. Her mother died of a fever when Delia was 11, and after that it was just her and her father in the small house by the ice house. 2 people who spoke a language of work and quiet devotion more than one of words. She grew into a young woman known around that river town for being unusually steady, unusually careful with her hands and her promises both. The kind of girl the shopkeepers trusted to make correct change, and the kind of girl the old women trusted to sit with the dying without flinching. When her father passed as well, from a lung sickness that had been creeping up on him for years, she was 22, unmarried, and entirely alone in the world, with only the skills he had given her and a small cedar chest of his tools and journals to her name. It was a cousin's letter, describing the open plains and the cattle money to be made in Montana Territory, that finally pulled her west, and it was there, in the town of Sable Creek, that she met Thomas Whitfield. Thomas was the younger son of Silas Whitfield, a hard, ambitious rancher who had built one of the largest cattle operations in that stretch of the territory through sheer stubbornness and a willingness to outlast anyone who crossed him. Thomas himself was nothing like his father, gentle where Silas was hard, curious where Silas was suspicious, a young man who loved horses more than money and who fell for Delia the very first week she arrived in town. When he watched her calmly talk a spooked draft horse back down from a panic that had already sent 2 ranch hands running. They married within the year over Silas's cold disapproval, Since he had wanted his son to marry into land and money rather than into a penniless ice cutter's daughter with nothing but a cedar chest to her name. Still, for 4 years, Delia and Thomas built a small, happy life together on a corner of the Whitfield spread that Thomas had been promised as his own inheritance, a life of shared work and quiet evenings, of Thomas teaching her to ride properly and Delia teaching him, in turn, the patient art of reading weather and ice and knowing when a thing that looked finished was not finished at all. She often told him about her father's lessons, about treasure that looked like nothing. And Thomas used to laugh and say that she'd found her proof of it already, since everyone in town had thought a poor ice cutter's daughter was nothing much to look at either, and look how that had turned out. Those 4 years were the only truly safe years of Delia's adult life, and she would carry the warmth of them like a coal banked deep in her chest through everything that came after. The fall came on a gray October morning, the kind of morning that begins ordinary and ends as the hinge on which an entire life turns. Thomas had ridden up into the high pasture with 2 hired men to bring down the last of the cattle before the first heavy snow, a route he had ridden 100 times before, along a narrow shelf of trail above a dry creek bed that everyone on the ranch knew and trusted. A slide of loose shale, shaken free by an early frost working its way into the rock, took the trail out from beneath his horse without warning, and Thomas Whitfield did not come home that night, nor any night after. Delia's grief was a private, wordless thing, the kind that does not announce itself, but Silas Whitfield's grief curdled almost immediately into blame, and the blame landed unfairly and entirely on her. He told anyone who would listen that it had been Delia's idea for Thomas to take that high trail instead of waiting another week for a safer path, a lie so complete that even some of the ranch hands who knew better found it easier to nod along than to contradict a grieving, powerful man. In truth, Silas had never forgiven Delia for not bringing land or money into the family, and Thomas's death handed him the excuse he had wanted for years to finally push her out and reclaim the parcel of the ranch that had been promised to his younger son. A parcel he intended now to fold quietly back into his own holdings and eventually hand to his elder son, Warren, a man cut from the same hard cloth as his father. Within a month of the burial, Silas informed Delia in front of the family lawyer and without a flicker of shame that the deed to the parcel she and Thomas had lived on had never actually been transferred into Thomas's name before his death, a technicality that meant, in the cold language of territorial law, that it reverted entirely to Silas as the ranch's sole owner. She had no children to fight for, no written promise strong enough to stand up in a territorial court against a man with Silas Whitfield's money and reputation, and no family of her own left to call upon for help. He gave her $3 silver, the exact amount, he said coldly, that her father's estate had once been valued at when Thomas foolishly married beneath himself, and told her the ranch hands had orders not to assist her. She packed the cedar chest that had been her father's, along with what little clothing and few keepsakes remained hers alone, and walked the 4 miles into Sable Creek with the late autumn wind cutting through her coat, arriving with nothing but that chest, $3, and a silence inside her that felt, for the first time in her life, truly bottomless. Sable Creek in that season was itself a town that had fallen on leaner times, though few of its people seemed to notice the shape of their own decline the way a stranger arriving fresh might. A rail spur, built 2 years earlier some 15 miles to the south, had redirected the shipping trade that once passed straight through town, and with it had gone much of the commerce that had kept smaller local trades alive, including, most quietly of all, the old harvesting and ice trade that had once supplied every household, saloon and butcher shop in the valley through the long, dry summers. Refrigerated rail cars now brought ice in from larger operations to the south, cheaper and more reliable than what any local outfit could manage, and the town's own ice house, a low, black-timbered building down by the bend in the creek that fed it, had simply gone dark and silent after its last owner. An elderly man named Jebediah Kirby passed away without heirs 2 winters before. The building sat behind the bank now, foreclosed upon for unpaid taxes, A fact Delia learned only because she happened to pass the notice pinned outside the county bank on the very morning after she arrived in town. Cold, friendless, and trying to work out how $3 might possibly become a roof over her head. The banker himself, a smooth, unhurried man named Augustus Pruitt, no relation to her own mother's family despite the shared name, stood on the bank steps that morning overseeing what he clearly expected to be a formality, a small public auction of the old Cowboy Icehouse and its contents to satisfy the unpaid taxes, with the building itself expected to fetch little more than the cost of tearing it down for lumber. A handful of townsfolk had gathered more out of idle curiosity than genuine interest, since nobody in Sable Creek wanted a defunct ice house when cheap rail ice sat waiting at the depot, and Pruitt seemed almost bored reading out the terms, clearly anticipating he would simply claim the property back onto the bank's own books at the opening bid. Delia stood at the back of that small crowd with her cedar chest at her feet, watching the old building's sagging roofline, and she felt something stir in her that she could not entirely name. Some echo of her father's voice telling her that ice was the strangest kind of treasure there was, worth nothing to the careless eye. When Pruitt called for an opening bid of $3, more as a formality than an expectation, Delia heard her own voice before she had entirely decided to speak, offering the exact sum in her palm, and in the silence that followed, nobody in that half-interested crowd bothered to bid against her. She walked down to the ice house that same afternoon with the deed to her name freshly inked, and stood for a long moment outside its door before she found the courage to lift the heavy iron latch, half expecting to find nothing inside but rot and ruin. The door groaned open onto a darkness that smelled of cold earth and old sawdust, a smell that struck her so suddenly and completely of her childhood that she nearly wept standing there in the doorway. And when her eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the high, narrow vents, she saw that the great room was still packed with old blocks of ice, half melted and refrozen many times over, layered beneath years of sawdust the way her father had once taught her to layer them herself. Whoever Jebediah Kirby had been, he had known his trade with the same devotion her own father once had, and something in that careful, patient packing told Delia immediately that this had not simply been a business to the old man, but something closer to a calling. In one corner she found his tools, still hanging in careful order on pegs along the wall, ice saws and tongs and a heavy wooden mallet, all of it kept as though he expected to return to work the very next morning. And beside the tools, tucked into a niche cut into the timber wall, she found a small leather-bound journal, its pages soft with handling, filled with Kirby's careful accounting of harvests and weather, and in the final pages, a scattering of odd, half-finished sentences that read less like a ledger and more like a man speaking quietly to whoever might come after him. The journal's last entries were the ones that stayed with her longest that first night. Huddled as she was beneath a horse blanket on the ice house floor, with nowhere else yet to go, Kirby had written, in a hand grown shaky with age, that he had kept back the deepest block of ice every single harvest for going on 11 years, never selling it, never touching it, referring to it only as the keeping block, and adding, in ink that looked as though it had been pressed hard enough to nearly tear the page, that he was holding it for when the town needed it most, and that he trusted whoever found it to understand that some things are worth freezing in place until the right hands come along to thaw them. Delia read those words 3 times over by the last gray light through the vents, and though she did not yet understand what they meant, she felt her father's old lesson settle over her like a second blanket against the cold, that a thing which looked like nothing at all to the careless eye was very often exactly the treasure a patient person had been waiting a long time to find. It took her the better part of 2 weeks, working alone in the bitter cold with borrowed tools and a stubbornness that surprised even herself, to work her way down through the packed layers of the ice house to the deepest corner Kirby's journal had marked with a small, deliberate X drawn in the margin of his final page. She was joined, toward the end of that fortnight, by a boy of perhaps 14 named Whitcomb Reyes, whose mother ran the town's boarding house and who had taken to bringing Delia bread and hot coffee out of a shy, Unspoken kindness after hearing whispers around town about the widow who had bought the old ice house for $3 and seemed determined to freeze to death inside it. Whitcomb had grown curious enough to ask if he might help. And Delia, recognizing in him some of her own younger self, a person eager to be useful and patient enough to be trusted with real work, taught him to read the ice the way her father had once taught her, testing thickness with the flat of the hand, learning which blocks would give way to a saw's edge and which needed the slower patience of a chisel. Together, on a cold Tuesday morning with pale winter light slanting through the high vents, their saw finally struck something that was not ice at all, but the dull, resistant clang of metal, and Delia felt her heart lift into her throat the way it had not done since Thomas's death. What they uncovered, once they had cleared away the last of the sawdust and chipped free the surrounding ice, was a lead-lined strongbox, its seams sealed with a tar-like compound that had kept the frost and damp from ever reaching inside. Exactly as a man who understood cold and patience both would have built it. Delia's hands shook as she worked the old lock free with one of Kirby's own tools, and when the lid finally gave way, what lay inside was not gold alone, though there was gold enough. A modest but real sum of coin wrapped carefully in oilcloth, but something Delia recognized, from her time listening to Thomas discuss ranch business, as far more consequential than money by itself. There was a thick, official-looking document, its wax seal cracked but intact, identifying itself as the original water rights charter for Sable Creek, granting the flow of the creek collectively to the town's founding families for the shared use of mill, farm, and ice house alike, a charter that predated the current county records by some 15 years. Folded inside that charter was a second document, far more damning, a private ledger page in a hand Delia did not recognize, detailing a quiet arrangement by which the town's water rights had, over the course of nearly a decade, been slowly and legally reassigned, parcel by parcel, into the private holdings of one man, through a series of small loans, foreclosures, and paper transfers that individually looked innocent, but together amounted to nothing less than the theft of an entire town's shared water from beneath its own feet. The name signed at the bottom of that ledger page, as the recipient of every single reassigned right, was Augustus Pruitt. Beneath both documents lay a letter addressed to no one in particular, written in Jebediah Kirby's own unsteady hand, explaining that he had first stumbled upon evidence of Pruitt's scheme some 11 years before, when the banker had tried to quietly foreclose on the ice house's own water access as part of the same slow campaign, and that Kirby, an old man with no family and no lawyer's fees to spare, had done the only thing he knew how to do, which was to hide the true charter and the evidence of the fraud in the one place he trusted absolutely. Beneath the ice he tended with his own two hands, waiting for an honest person to come along who would know how to thaw it out at the proper time. He wrote that he had grown too old and too alone to fight Pruitt in a courtroom, but that he refused to let the truth simply die with him in the ground, and so he had frozen it instead, the way a person freezes a thing precious enough to save for a hungrier season. Delia sat on the cold floor of that ice house for a long while after reading it, Whitcomb quiet and wide-eyed beside her, and she understood, with a clarity that steadied her shaking hands, that she had not simply found a fortune. She had found a debt 11 years overdue, and a town that did not yet know it was owed anything at all. Word of what had been found beneath the old Kirby ice traveled through Sable Creek faster than any spring thaw, and it did not take more than 3 days before Augustus Pruitt himself came walking down to the ice house, smiling the same smooth, unhurried smile he wore on the bank steps, to inform Delia that whatever had been found on the property legally belonged to the bank, since the bank had held the deed prior to her purchase, and any contents therein were, in his words, an oversight of the auction rather than a rightful part of the sale. He suggested, not quite as a threat but close enough to one, that a woman alone with no standing in town and no family to speak for her would find it very difficult indeed to make any claim stand up against the word of the county's most established banker, and that it would go far easier for her and far more profitably too, if she simply handed the strongbox over quietly and let him decide what, if anything, was worth making public. Delia had spent enough winters learning patience from her father, and enough years learning to hold her ground from her own hard-won grief, to recognize the shape of a man trying to freeze her out of a fight before it even properly began, and she told him, with a steadiness that surprised even her, that she intended to have the charter examined by the Territorial Land Office before she handed over so much as a single coin. Pruitt's smile did not waver, but the town began to feel the pressure of his displeasure within the week, in ways both large and small. Merchants who had extended Delia small kindnesses, a bit of credit at the mercantile, a warm meal at the boarding house in exchange for mending, suddenly grew cautious, having been quietly reminded by the banker of loans he held over their own establishments, loans that could be called due at his discretion. Whitcomb's mother was warned, gently but unmistakably, that the boarding house's own mortgage was held by Pruitt's bank, and Whitcomb himself was forbidden for a time from helping Delia further, a prohibition the boy honored with visible unhappiness but honored nonetheless, since his mother's roof mattered more than his own restless curiosity. Even Silas Whitfield, hearing of the discovery from town gossip, rode in from his ranch for the first time since casting Delia out, not out of any softened feeling toward her, but out of a hard calculation that if the old Whitfield parcel's own water access had ever been touched by Pruitt's scheme, he intended to be first in line to claim whatever restitution might be owed, regardless of what it cost the woman he had already tried once to erase from his family's history. For a handful of cold weeks that winter, Delia found herself standing nearly alone against the combined, if uncoordinated, self-interest of two of the most powerful men in that stretch of the territory, with only a boy, his cautious mother, and a strongbox full of 11-year-old paper standing beside her. What turned the tide, in the end, was not a courtroom nor a sudden change of heart in either man, but the same patient, careful method Delia had learned at her father's side and had already used once to save herself. She spent those cold weeks not arguing with Pruitt in public, where his smooth manner and established reputation would always outmatch her own, but quietly gathering corroboration, riding out with Whitcomb's careful help to visit 3 of the oldest surviving founding families still living on land along the creek, families whose own fading memories and half-forgotten deeds, once compared against Kirby's charter and the hidden ledger, matched perfectly, parcel for parcel, with the pattern of quiet reassignments the old man had documented. She wrote, in her own plain and careful hand, a full account of what had been found and what it meant, and sent copies not to the county courthouse alone, where Pruitt's influence ran deep, but directly to the Territorial Land Office some 60 miles distant, along with a request, signed also by the founding families she had visited, for an independent review of the water rights records. It was a slow method, built on patience rather than confrontation, the same kind of patience her father had once told her was the very opposite of weakness. And it worked precisely because it gave a corrupt man no single dramatic moment to fight against, only a widening, undeniable weight of evidence he could not smother quietly the way he had smothered smaller complaints for years. The Territorial Land Office's ruling came down in early spring, delivered by a circuit judge who rode into Sable Creek with 2 deputies and a stack of confirmed documents, and it was as thorough a vindication as Delia could have hoped for. The original charter was declared valid and binding, restoring the creek's water rights collectively to the town's founding families and their heirs. Delia herself now counted among them by virtue of her ownership of the icehouse and Kirby's clear intent that she should stand as his rightful successor. Pruitt's decade of quiet reassignments were unwound parcel by parcel under the judge's order, and though the law proved gentler with him than the town's own anger might have been, stopping short of criminal charges given the technically legal paperwork behind each individual transfer, he was stripped of every water right he had accumulated, fined a sum that badly wounded his bank's standing, and made to post the full judgment publicly on the very courthouse steps where he had once auctioned off Kirby's icehouse as worthless. He left Sable Creek within the year, his reputation too thinned to recover, and the bank passed into more careful hands. Silas Whitfield, for his part, found his own calculated claim to any restitution collapsing the moment the judge's inquiry turned up the very deed technicality he had once used to strip Delia of her land, a technicality that, examined properly under the same honest scrutiny, revealed he had backdated the transfer paperwork after Thomas's death rather than before it. A fraud far smaller than Pruitt's, but no less plainly dishonest under the law. He was made, under quiet threat of his own prosecution, to sign the original parcel back over to Delia in full, the very land she had once shared with Thomas, though she chose in the end not to return to it, feeling that its walls no longer held anything she wished to reclaim. What Delia did with the gold from beneath the ice, and with the restored water rights that came with it, was never a decision she agonized long over, since her father's old lessons had left little room in her for greed, even in a moment when greed would have been easily forgiven. She used a portion of the coin to repair the town's aging flume and mill race, work that put half a dozen idle men back to steady wages through that spring, and set aside the larger remainder, together with a fair share of her restored land's income, to found a small schoolhouse for Sable Creek's children, a building she insisted on siting just beside the ice house itself, so that the two structures might stand together as a kind of matched pair, one preserving what the town needed to survive its summers, the other preserving what it needed to survive every season after. She kept the ice house running as well, not merely as a memorial to Jebediah Kirby's patient faith, but as a working trade once more, since she had learned firsthand that summer that plenty of families in that valley still could not easily afford rail-shipped ice, and that a well-tended local supply, kept honest and kept fair, was worth more to a town's daily life than any single grand gesture could be. Whitcomb Reyes, freed at last from his mother's cautious silence once Pruitt's influence had crumbled, became her first and most devoted apprentice, learning the trade at her side much as she had once learned it at her own father's, and it was a particular, quiet joy to her to watch him grow steady and capable in exactly the way she had been. And so it was, in the end, that Delia Whitfield, 29 years old and standing at the edge of a gravel road with $3 silver and nowhere to call home, turned out to be exactly the patient, unassuming person that old Jebediah Kirby had been waiting 11 long winters to find, though neither of them had ever met, and though he had died not knowing her name. She had been cast out by a man who mistook her steadiness for weakness and her lack of land for a lack of worth. And she had answered that mistake not with anger, but with the same quiet, faithful patience her own father had once shown her over a Wisconsin river. The belief that a thing frozen and overlooked is not therefore a thing without value. That sometimes the treasure a whole town has forgotten it needs is sitting exactly where no one thought to look, packed carefully in sawdust and cold, waiting only for someone willing to dig deep enough and wait long enough to bring it back into the light. The ice house that had seemed on that gray winter morning like the last foolish purchase of a desperate woman, became instead the very foundation of her restoration, and of her town's as well, and those who had once called her a fool for spending her last $3 on a ruin came, in time, to understand that she had bought something far more valuable than lumber and old ice. She had bought the patience to wait for the truth to thaw. Thank you for spending this time with Delia's story tonight, and with all the quiet, overlooked corners of the world it was meant to bring to mind. If this story stirred something in you, we would love to hear it in the comments below. And we mean this question honestly. What is a time in your own life when you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? A person, a place, or a possession the world called worthless until you were patient enough to look closer? Share your story with us and with each other, because we believe there is a whole community here built on exactly that kind of quiet, patient hope. If you enjoyed this journey into Sable Creek, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell so you never miss the next story we have waiting for you. And if you know someone who needs a reminder that overlooked things can still hold everything, send this one their way. Until next time, stay close.